be joined with such prestigious speakers and guests here. And so I'd like to thank and recognize Daniel, SC, Anthony, Gilbert. Cloud computing is something that is very global in nature. And Hong Kong has a tradition in thinking globally and innovating globally in terms of commerce, finance. And we have a lot of work to do in thinking through how we secure and build trust in something that is, at its core, something that will only work if it's thought of as a global compute utility. These are exciting times. If you are ready for change, if you have aspirations of starting a successful company, of breaking into a new industry, of changing the world, these are exciting times. If you don't want change, if you want to retire, these maybe are very scary times. So the thing that I want you to think about is that whenever we come to something that represents a brand new generation of technology, brand new innovations that create this new generation of thinking, that all of our countries, all of the leaders in an industry, we all come back to the starting line. We're all at the same place, and no one has a significant competitive advantage over anyone else. It's going to be what we do from now on that's going to determine our success in working together, our success in providing good security, our success in dealing with malicious actors, our success in providing a better world. So what I want to talk about is to this, specifically to cloud computing, how we think this is all happening. So cloud, I like to think of cloud computing as being one of a few different consequences of what we call technology consumerization. We're able to purchase, rent, subscribe, use so much technology on a daily basis that we are really still at the infancy of that. But some of the consequences of this that I like to point out certainly are cloud, which is this using compute as a utility. Mobility, the Internet of Things. You are all going to have in your homes in the next 2 years probably over 100 IP addresses. If you don't already. There's probably some geeks out here that might already have exceeded that. We're going to have so much computerization, so many connected devices, that this ubiquity of technology is something we still don't even understand necessarily how we're going to deal with it. The digital natives, the millennials, the kids, they understand this. I don't see too many of them here today, anyone who doesn't remember a world before the internet. But that generation, every day, they are changing our companies, they are changing our governments, they are changing society to look more like them and more like this ubiquitous use of technology. So compute being a utility, I think it's very appropriate we have a partner here like the Internet Society, because I really view cloud computing as sort of internet too. So the internet was all about creating this global communications and connectivity between all these different computing resources. And remember how amazing that was when you first had that ability to, probably pre-web, but through Gopher and FTP and things like that, to actually go access a research server in another continent. And those were pretty exciting times. What the cloud is really leveraging that communications network that we've built and actually optimizing it to create this utility by moving the compute resources where it makes most sense. And then we use this as a pay-per-use type of model. It's really simple. That's a really simple thing, that instead of buying computers, putting them in my data center, putting them in my home, that we actually use those compute resources somewhere else through the internet. Seems very simple. But the changes that is creating in industry are so profound that I don't think we have even really comprehended all those differences. I like to relate the apocryphal story that you've probably heard of and from several different instances, but a large pharmaceutical manufacturer who had a drug researcher for a new drug going through clinical trials needing to have a lot of compute resources for the research. So the compute power that was required for this was such that the IT department said, we will provide this to you. It will take 3 months. It will take several $100,000 US. And that person, that researcher, they went out to a public cloud provider. They took their credit card. They purchased or rented the service, and they did the same thing in 4 hours' time for $89. And the big impact, the big thing to think about is not that large pharmaceutical company with 100,000 employees saved $300,000 US, but in fact that they were able to 3 months quicker move that drug forward, where the cost of time for a new drug is about $150 a second. But even beyond that, you had one person who suddenly decided, maybe I didn't need that company, maybe I didn't need those 100,000 employees. What does that mean to any industry that's out there? So we don't know all of the results, all of the consequences of cloud, but I do think Aristotle's words were very accurate. Maybe that's Aristotle calling us right now, I don't know. That revolutions come from simple things, but the revolution itself is not simple. So I often show this slide just to discuss how I think these things work together and create some very important challenges for us from an enterprise perspective, from a government perspective to think through. So cloud and mobile, which mobile is another one of these consequences of technology consumerization, they create these environments where we maybe have private clouds, maybe we are trying to keep information in our own data centers for now. Maybe we have some clouds that are co-located in other public data centers. Maybe we're using public cloud computing. So that's sort of represented on the top there, where you can see, you can have your information, your back-end systems be located about anywhere. But then also we have this cloud of users that mobility is enabling. And last year was that watershed year where the number of total tablets, smartphones, exceeded worldwide shipments of personal computers. It's a big, significant moment. So now we have these cloud of users, and you have that phenomena where individuals are procuring services for their business that might be through that public cloud, and not a single IP packet traverses that corporate network, which is represented by everything to the right of that vertical dashed line. So you have this broad disbursement of applications, of data, of users, of devices, and the genie's out of the bottle. Pandora's out of the box, or whatever was in Pandora's box. So this is the issue we need to deal with. If you have been in the information security industry, like myself, for 20 years, that's kind of a scary depiction there, because how we think through how we control that environment becomes very challenging. We sometimes talk about this as being shadow IT, the ability for users, business units to be able to create their own IT systems. But I also think of it as our traditional IT that we think we know and we think we control, and the blinking lights we see in our data center and the PCs that we see that are hardwired to a corporate network. That's actually the mirage IT, because that doesn't represent everything that is in its accumulation providing the computing services to our enterprise. So the sort of rote definition done very well by NIST, and we have my esteemed colleague Tim Grants here is going to provide the second keynote, is something that is probably you've all seen, and I don't spend a lot of time on it, but I definitely encourage you to follow what they're doing for all further definitional work on cloud and where it's going with brokering, a lot of the architectural aspects to it. But what I usually like to talk about here, and the point I like to make, is that what were the drivers, what were the industry drivers that got us to cloud computing? And where are they going to take us? So Moore's Law is certainly something that has been very fundamental, that the cost of computing sort of approaches closer to zero as you continue to have this doubling in the price performance of compute, and memory and networking, they all follow similar sort of 18 to 30 month cycles. This broad hyperconnectivity has enabled what I've described as this global compute utility. And obviously scale. When you think about what was a large enterprise application 10 years ago, gosh, this application can serve 100,000 users, 250,000 users. That's a large enterprise application. How many users does Facebook service? The world, everything. So that's the difference in cloud from a scale perspective that is creating some very brutal economics, and is really what I want to impress upon you. It's creating a mandate for efficiency that is going to be a wave that I believe is going to take over a lot of the forms of computing. SOA, service-oriented architecture, and there's other acronyms I could throw out, REST, other things like that. Very important to think about, because cloud computing is not the centralization of compute per se. Centralization is happening, but it's centralized orchestration of compute resources that, as mobility grows, may actually be physically distributed. So think about that for a little bit here. That orchestration will create a lot of challenges in how we are able to develop security controls when we can't say, well, it wasn't our data center here. Now we know it's in that data center over there, because it's not. It's going to be more pervasive than that. But can we trust this? Can we trust cloud computing? Can we trust what we're doing internally is probably a good question as well. I don't think there's anyone who empirically has actually been able to provide hard data that said public cloud versus traditional IT versus private clouds, which is more secure. The issue, the number one point I have here, is that we're lacking that transparency from our public cloud providers, as well as the visibility into what those systems are doing, so that we don't know. It's a black box. They're encouraging us for this efficiency to say, let us manage your data, let us manage availability. And so it's hard to know if we don't have that proper transparency to say, are we being compliant with the laws of our land? Do we understand the laws of the land that these data centers might be in? Probably if we had very many Europeans in the audience here, they'd probably say the third issue, data sovereignty. Do we understand, is that information in control of governments that are compliant with our data protection through safe harbor, or is it resident in our own countries, and does that data move between countries? We do have incomplete standards. We have a lot of people working on standards, but the inability to really know if the technology, the systems we're building today will be standards compliant in the future becomes a real challenge and a real question. Cloud has been moving very quickly, and essentially a lot of what I've been describing is really a new business model with existing technology. We're going to need to move that. We're going to need to change that to actually having true purpose-built multi-tenant architectures and new technologies that actually can understand and provide all of that context to say we have competitive organizations that are all sharing their information in one utility. There's some technology there that we don't have fully implemented yet. And a big one for me is where are the end users of cloud, whether they're governments, whether they're enterprises. Are they very aware of the issues, and are they very forcefully advocating these needs to the providers? Because the providers, at the end of the day, they want to build something that is going to make them money, make it available to the widest possible market, and the market needs to speak. So you've heard a little bit about the Cloud Security Alliance, and we're actually up to about, I think, 35,000 individual members, and our newest official chapter here in Hong Kong and Macau, and I just checked the website. It does say it's an official chapter this morning, so the websites never lie, so I trust that that's the case, so congratulations here. We've only been around for less than 4 years, actually, but we've been able to grow very quickly because we didn't use traditional organizational models. Think of us as a purposeful social network focused on the research that's needed and done in a way that mimics an agile software development model. Let's come up with the ideas, let's iterate them very fast, let's keep pace with commerce. And we have several different areas where we focus on: the research, education, certification, helping governments, helping us understand the policy requirements that are required to support this global utility, and innovation. That's what we're about. So there certainly are a lot of efforts that are underway, and I think it's very important that we know that there's never going to be one policy, one certification, one regulation to rule them all. We're going to see and continue to exist in a world that's going to have a lot of competing jurisdictions. So in Europe, there is a data privacy directive that has been existing since 1995, which is in the process of being updated. And a directive is something that basically directs different countries to create their own laws. And what they're trying to do in Europe, which is very significant to all of us around the world, is they're trying to create a regulation, which is different because the regulation becomes not a directive for you to create your own laws, but one law that would apply. And it deals a lot with the issues around how you deploy cloud computing and the privacy requirements, the risk assessment requirements. There's a lot of debate and competing interests, and we'll see if this comes to fruition, but very possibly it will in early next year. There's a lot of work that the European Commission is doing in public-private industry. Cloud Security Alliance, through our European entity and chapters, we're participating in 4 research projects related to certification, governance, automation of controls monitoring, a lot of issues like that through the European Commission FP7 initiative. U.S. federal government has done obviously quite a bit, and NIST has done some of the very early work in trying to taxonomize what we're doing. And as myself, I happen to be a U.S. citizen. When I travel around the world, there's a lot of things people don't like about the U.S. government, but they seem to like NIST. So we're doing one good thing, I think, in the U.S. federal government anyway. So Tim usually gets free drinks in different countries around the world. FedRAMP is the program that the U.S. government is enacting to allow the ability to share certifications essentially by different agencies. So one agency does a risk assessment and approves a cloud provider. The idea is that can be shared by the other agencies and be more efficient rather than every single one needing to go from start to finish to do the certification and accreditation of a provider. Very significant if that works right. We're actually working, as I'll talk a little bit later, to take a FedRAMP approach to how we can use Cloud Security Alliance best practices for different governments around the world. So I definitely would like to talk to Daniel at some point about how we could use some of that to create the same approach in Hong Kong. There's certainly a lot of good work that's happening within the Asia Pacific region, and I think we're seeing probably on the innovation side, we're seeing a lot of creation of new companies, new technologies, which I think the new technologies have a great potential to actually make a lot of the policy issues moot. And probably Asia Pacific is the strongest area that I see in terms of having an engaged approach into international standards bodies. Taking it very seriously, the participation in the ISO SC27 group, and there's several different standards underway, 27036 for supply chain outsourcing security models, 27017, which is ISMS designed for cloud computing, as well as an update to 27001 and 27002, which certainly have a lot of relevance to this. So there's a lot of work there. There's, I think, a need for us to look at how we can integrate global standards within national regulations rather than duplicating them, referencing them where we can. And certainly a government can control the consequences of someone failing to meet regulatory mandates, but we shouldn't be prescribing things that are counter to the international standards bodies when we're able to. So CSA's position is we work with all of these. We see ourselves as an incubator of best practices that can influence standards bodies. And in several cases, if we're not just collaborating, we're actually writing some of those standards in consort with standards bodies and governments. So Cloud Security Alliance has a lot of different areas where we're contributing research. And all of our research, we have an interesting business model. It's all free. So we'll see how that works in the long run. But we make all of our research tools, best practices, freely available, no licensing fees for you to use. For you to use if you're a cloud customer, as an individual, to be able to increase your knowledge, for developing products even, to be able to use some of our best practices inside of products. So we're very open in how all of this happens. So the core of what we have developed is essentially creating some guidance, which is 14 domains of concern, which is our fundamental research. So cloud is moving very quickly. And cloud computing will probably look very different 2 years from now than it does today. But that central part, the 14 domains, that represents the key areas of concern that we think will not change. The details and what's inside of those certainly will. So you have to think about the architectural issues. When we think about how we develop IT architectures, and a lot of it does get translated into physical devices, that becomes very difficult to sort of align with more of a services-based model. And so we are very much encouraging a view of cloud that is more virtual. I'm not just talking about virtual operating systems, but a completely virtual view of IT and a completely virtual view of the world. So I don't know how many of you here are familiar with the OSI 7-layer model. That was something I cut my teeth on when it was first out. And a lot of people don't remember that OSI was actually also a protocol. And that protocol obviously wasn't the one that became predominant. It was TCP/IP that became the predominant protocol. But still, if you were building an enterprise network, a regional network, a local area network, you're connecting PCs to gateways, the OSI model was a fundamental way that we thought about a representation of our networks. And it even became a very popular part of the IT nomenclature, where we talk a lot about layer 3 when we talk about routers and where things are connected. Layer 7, the application layer. Layer 8, that really stupid layer we'd often talk about. Layer 8 was the person, the user. So it always said, you know, build an idiot-proof computer system and they'll build a better idiot, was something that I've always heard. But the Cloud Security Alliance is encouraged. We've developed sort of a 10-layer model in that architectural white paper, which takes what NIST has done in the definitions of software as a service, full business application, which is built upon platform as a service, rapid application development environment, which is built on infrastructure as a service, operating system and storage, and create that model so we understand what are all the layers of abstraction between those different layers? What are the pieces that abstract that? And it's very important as we think about architectures for cloud, because those different layers represent different businesses. And we're all very concerned about, are we going to get locked into an organization, or what if there's a point of failure with that cloud provider? That's where understanding this from a very flexible architectural perspective makes a lot of sense, because you're able to see how you can build in the redundancies. You're able to see, well, if I can develop a little bit of middleware between myself and that big cloud provider, then if I need to move to cloud provider B, I only need to change that different layer there. So architecture is very important. Governance is an area that covers several different domains. You see them here: risk management, legal, compliance. And this is very important for us to think about how we extend an organizational's governance, doing the right thing, complying with the law. How do we extend that outside of our organization to all of our business partners who are providing us compute services in the cloud? And then the other domain is the operational domain, and understanding what are the things that we need to be thinking about that we did in the past that are still relevant, like the disaster recovery sorts of issues, and how do we quickly move systems and recover from failures? How do things like patching of systems apply in the cloud? What are some of the specific things we need to do to make sure that virtualization is secured? So out of that fundamental body of work, there's just been, you can see sort of a flowering of different research projects that have come out of that relate to data governance, that relate to emergency response, that relate to more specific compliance types of tools, that relate to personal certification. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of different of those, but as a leave behind, I want to make sure that you are getting yourself familiar with this research. It's free, and we need an educated public to actually be contributing to this research and using it every day. That's how it's going to get better. So the GRC stack is something I want to point out is we think of this as probably our most important area of research today. So this is a family of 4 research projects that we think are fundamental in how we enact a lot of these best practices we've talked about in our infrastructure related to governance, risk management, and compliance. So the Cloud Controls Matrix is a controls framework that we've developed that is specific to cloud computing. What this does is it creates the security controls that relate to what a provider should be doing, the security controls that a consumer needs to be enacting. What are the security controls that maybe are shared that both sides need to be concerned about? And how does that control relate to specific cloud implementation, software as a service, infrastructure as a service? Because certain things, infrastructure as a service is not going to do. It's your job to take a plain vanilla Amazon web service and add the security controls that you need on top of that. So on top of that framework, we built something called CAI, the Consensus Assessments Initiative. It's a questionnaire, and this is a free questionnaire you can be using that you could go and spend thousands and thousands of dollars to go create your own. This is something that was developed by a lot of top cloud consumers out there, Global 2000 companies, and it basically asks a lot of the questions that you could do in an out-of-the-box assessment, a lot of the questions that you might want to put in contracts and in service level agreements and in just the negotiation with cloud providers. So it's very important to take a lot of those risk assessment, compliance approaches that we've had and make them cloud savvy. So the bottom 2 parts of those are what are going to, I think, move us into the next generation and be able to scale GRC as quickly as the cloud is growing. So that's the Cloud Trust Protocol and Cloud Audit. So these are projects that are intended to build automation of GRC, because I liken GRC to hygiene of your teeth. You probably should go to the dentist once a year, maybe twice a year, but you should probably also brush your teeth a few times every day. And unfortunately, the common trend with every large company that has been hacked, it's, as far as I can tell, is they were all compliant with something. They're all certified. But a lot of times those certifications become irrelevant if you don't continuously keep up with the program. So what we're trying to do here is to create the specifications that you can implement on your side if you're a customer, if you're a cloud provider that you can implement, to create this closed loop continuous monitoring and have real-time governance, risk, and compliance management. Very important. We're sort of in the pilot stage with a lot of major cloud providers and customers this year. We hope to have a lot of those implementations done. So the top issue I think I talked about was the transparency and visibility into what our cloud provider is doing. I'm sure if I were to ask for a show of hands, and I won't, but everybody would want to know more information about your cloud provider. Don't we all want to understand, what are you doing? What are your policies? Do you do web assessments of your applications? Do you do some sort of screening or have some assurances on the employees that are working there? So from technical to personnel to policy, there's a lot of things we'd like to know about our cloud providers. So we've built this assessment questionnaire. What Cloud Security Alliance has announced and launched is something called STAR, which is our Security Trust and Assurance Registry. And this is something it's free for providers, keeping with our spirit. They can go take the assessment questionnaire, do a self-assessment, and post that on our STAR registry. It's free for consumers to use, so you can go look at it. And this is intended to be not as much as a tool as a movement, I think, a social movement to say that providers need to be very transparent with what they're doing. That's how we're going to have a better assurance about security. And the information about the security programs that providers have is something that consumers have a right to. This is a right, a fundamental right that you need to have. If you cannot any longer economically have those systems internally, then you should have the ability to ask what are all those systems that exist out in the provider and how they're being controlled. There's a level here of certainly a lot of technical details that a provider I wouldn't want them to disclose, but from a governance, from a GRC perspective, I certainly do. So the message here, because this is fairly new, we've only got a few entries out there now, is if you're a cloud consumer, you need to be asking for these registry entries. Every time you talk to a provider, you need to ask them, where's your STAR entry? Well, more and more are doing it. I think you're going to see a lot of exciting announcements about new providers that are participating in this over the next couple of months. But we need to continue to push this. If we're providers, if we're consultants, if we're trying to help on the assurance side, we need to promote global transparency. And this is an easy mechanism to do that. So last week we also announced, building on this, a project not released yet, but to create a certification framework. And what we're really trying to do here is to create, it's a little bit hard to taxonomize, and I don't know if we'd call it a certification of certifications, but an ability to use our credibility, our best practices to encourage certifications, because there's been a lot of demand for it, and we want this to be done right. But the things we want to do, for example, are to provide very clear guidance on here's how we would scope an ISO 27001 certification to address a lot of these issues. And here's how you would maybe do that with what used to be called a SAS 70, SSAE 16 SOC 2, an auditor's attestation. How would you do that in a way that you would include more of this information that's required for cloud provider assurance? And also providing a lot of our framework so that governments around the world could build their own FedRAMPs, for example. Because again, we've sort of tried to take a pragmatic approach. There's not going to be one certification out there, but how can we link together different provider certifications together in a coherent way so that a provider can develop one security program that complies with the greatest possible number of jurisdictional concerns, compliance concerns that are out there. So this is something that we announced last week. You can find out more information on our website. We intend to have the first version of this released in Q2, and we'll be making a lot of announcements in the next few months about how this is going to play out. So the CCSK, this is something that the local chapter talked to Anthony about this, but this is something we'll be working on ways to employ this locally. This is the user certification, the certificate of cloud security knowledge that, again, all of our knowledge is free, but you do have to pay a little bit of money to go get training and take a test if you want to do that. But we are encouraging more and more professionals to get this. It's the only certification in the world that's specific to cloud security. And we're also encouraging you to ask if the employees of the cloud provider that you're working with, if they are also getting their employees trained to understand all those other issues, understand all those governance issues that exist. So a couple more things I want to highlight that we're working on. So the second half of our mission statement, in addition to securing the cloud, is to look at how is cloud computing going to fundamentally change the information security industry. So we think that the industry itself is going to need to be reinvented. You go back to that diagram of the cloud of users, that they're going to be connecting to public cloud services. They're not going to traverse over with a single IP packet our infrastructure that we've architected and rolled out. There's only one way we're going to secure that. That is through cloud delivered services. That's how we're going to secure mobile devices. That's how we're going to secure the 8 billion devices in the Internet of Things, which is coming soon. That's how we're going to do it. So we've done research here on how do we translate a lot of the traditional domains or industry sectors in information security, data loss prevention, web security, email security, and how do you actually look for that? How do you implement that? How should it be specified? And this is, as many of our projects are, it's a work in progress, but we think security as a service is basically going to be the security industry, so we need to figure that out. So mobile, this is something you might go, does mobile really fit in with cloud? And like I said, I think it's sort of the sister consequence of technology consumerization to cloud. And I think it's going to be the main way that we access cloud computing. And I think you're going to see a lot of the information that's stored on mobile devices, like with the Apple devices and the iCloud, there's going to be a very close synergy there. You're going to see more and more organizations requiring that that the mobile devices be personally owned, and yet they're going to want to put some of the corporate business applications on your device. So there's a lot of very complex issues that we need to figure out here. What about application stores? Do you have a lot of confidence in how secure they are? These are cloud delivered stores that are touching your smart mobile devices. Do you have any visibility how that works? Do you have concerns about that? We certainly do have concerns. So we're working a lot with how do we develop secure applications in this environment? How do we create appropriate guidance with how a device can at the same time be personally owned as well as being a corporate organizational resource? So what's the proper architecture? How much security do you put on that device versus, to the previous slide, how much gets delivered through the cloud? So this is research that we've just kicked off. Our intention is to have a very full and rich delivery of research in the November timeframe at our Congress in Orlando, Florida. And we think this is probably going to be as big as the entire CSA organization. It's probably going to double it in size, just the work we intend to be doing on the mobile side. So this is a collaboration between the providers, the telcos, people developing applications, the handset makers. So it's a broad group, but we want individuals involved in this. So migrating to the cloud, it's not something that we can wait for. It's something we just have to have smart strategies around. We need to understand this is a shared responsibility. It's the consumers and the providers and government and auditors. We all need to be working together on this. It's something you need to understand where you are in the cloud. If you're doing virtual machines, infrastructures as a consumer, a lot of the responsibility for building the security goes with you or with your consultants. If you're purchasing a lot of software as a service, it becomes more of a governance and an assessment responsibility. Either way, we're both involved. So let's think about, do we have the proper education? Do we know all of the issues? Do we know all of the best practices? Have you all read the guides? Have you read all 170 pages of it? Do we have the right architectures? And are we taking all the good practices with risk management, due diligence, vendor management, and are we applying that to the cloud? So there's certainly a lot of challenges here that we have. Hopefully you're enthused that there's a lot of opportunities as well. There are some tools, hopefully I pointed out, that you can be working with. I get really concerned if again, going back to my diagram about the ideas of waiting and let's let some other organization solve these problems. Because if you have those digital natives, if you have those millennials in your organization, they're using the mobile devices to access your information, and they're bypassing the organization to do that. So we can't wait. We got to be agile. We got to do these things today. We have to all work together. We have to work together in industries, consumers versus providers. And most importantly, I think we have to work on this globally, country to country. And that's where something I think CSA can really continue to be a vital force in basically creating that community of dialogue between all the different constituencies around the world, because there's only one language here, and that's the cloud right now. So there's our website, there's all the information. I'm sure they're going to make the presentation available, but I want to thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to many more visits to Hong Kong, Macau in the future to see this chapter grow. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Jim.